Welcome to the Ages of Rock podcast with your hosts, Bill Algie, Dennis Talbot, and Alan Tate. We are three guys who have one thing in common, a love of rock and roll. Our goal is to talk about all things rock. We hope you find this show intriguing, funny, and occasionally highly opinionated. Enjoy! Hey folks, first and foremost, happy Thanksgiving if you're in the United States, and if you're elsewhere, happy Thursday. This is episode number 368, and this week we have a guest, Gary Graff, and he is going to talk about his book, 501 Essential Albums of the 90s, The Music Fan's Definitive Guide, and it was described to me as a book that is written to start arguments.
Those are the first words you read in the book.
So tell us a little bit about what gave you the idea to do the book and how that theme came up.
So this is my, I think, fourth or fifth book with this publisher, and we have a good arrangement, nice relationship. And so there was a discussion, and they had in mind to do some sort of book series and album series. And I had done many years ago, back in the 90s, a series called Music Hound, which was another essential album guide series. And that one we did by genre. And this one we went with decades, and let's take the various decades and break it down and talk about. Initially, this was going to be the best albums, which is a different kind of challenge, and Essential kind of honed it in a little differently. It made us make different choices and look at the mission of the book differently. But I think that I liked working with Essential better than best. And, we've got the 90s just out. We've got the 80s coming in May. And cool. we're looking ahead to what's going to be next.
That's really cool. Looking at your lanyards behind you, you are...
I've been doing...
You're a fan.
Let's do it this way. I started doing it when I had hair, and the hair I had was brown.
So for a couple of years.
It's been a good 5 decades of this for me.
There you go. No, I like looking at your book because the 90s for me was when I kind of checked out for a while. It was, we were through the 80s, we were I was kind of in the hair thing, of course, and when the 90s come around, when grunge hit, I just checked out of rock. And I'm not a country fan. Bill, I think Bill went more country at some point.
I did.
Talk about that at some point.
Yeah.
But, that's when I started kind of going backward. The 90s for me were reliving of course, at that time, I think at that point, I don't know if it hit yet or if it was called yacht rock, but it was the 80s gold type music.
Right.
And I reverted back to that starting, and of course, Napster and that came out toward the end of the 90s. That's when I was pulling every song, that I didn't have the albums was. I was, trying to rip every song I could down to my hard drive. But which now I bought all the albums because I'm into vinyl again. But that book was interesting because, looking through it, that showed me and the fact of that you didn't just take one genre. You went through the albums of the 90s. It's kind of cool to look back and say, well, I do remember that. I do remember that. And 90s wasn't such a scrub that I thought it was because there was some good music back then.
No scrubs. No, there were no scrubs in the 90s.
Actually, there was no scrubs in the 90s. That's when the song came out. I
was trying to get a pun in.
There you go.
Oh, that was good. That was a good act right there. It's interesting because there are a lot of people. You're not the only one who feels that way about the 90s. And I had a lot of people kind of raise their eyebrows, about us starting first with the 90s. I had a lot of the comments, were there 501 albums in the 90s? And, 501 seems like a big number when you start. And then when you compile a long list of 2,300, from which you have to whittle down to the 501, it's not such a big number anymore. But it was an interesting decade in that regard. I call it to me, it's the last golden decade of the album. And that's because when we got into the 90s, albums were still the currency of music consumption. And
Sure.
Certainly every music geek listen to albums, and your currency was talking about an album, an entire album, and talking about the deep cuts and the non-hits and things like that. And we left the decade getting into Napster and file sharing and P2P and the bedwork of the way we consume music now, which is not by album anymore. So, this was the last decade where the number one album on the Billboard 200 chart each week was selling 500,000, 800,000, a million copies a week. And it makes me sad to even talk about it like that. And yes, I'll tell you to get off my lawn too. But
he fits right in.
Me too.
But I still think
we need another member to this podcast. Gary, we'll talk to you later after
absolutely,
after the show.
Absolutely. But I still think the album is the greatest. For music is the creative currency. Serious artists, and they're still around us.
Mm-hmm.
They're just not selling albums in the numbers they used to. But serious artists make albums. They make a piece of work. They make a journey. And that's, to me, is still the best way to hear music. And that's not to slight the hit single. In the best of all worlds, you have some great hit singles on great albums.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, that's one of the things for me in the 90s. The Napster thing brought out, I can get the 2 or 3 songs off an album that I want, and I don't have to listen to the other stuff that I feel like is filler or garbage, so that while I hate to see what it did to the music industry, I understand why it happened.
Well, what precipitated that too was, this is a book-length topic in itself, but the CD happened to the music industry, and all of a sudden these artists were basically not only able to make a double album length, piece of work to fit on a CD. A 72-minute CD is the equivalent of a double vinyl album. So all of a sudden, every album that came out was a two LP set. And that's hard to sustain. So you did start to have a lot of albums, and also they were upcharging, for those CDs were not priced like vinyl. And so you did have consumer resentment that, okay, I'm paying more to get a lot more music, but not necessarily a lot more better music. Right. Just a lot more music. And so, yeah, you do, that was really that's what led people to steal music, with Napster and everything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we stopped getting the 32-minute Van Halen albums,
Right. Right. And it's funny, Don Was, the producer, is a good friend of mine. And he took a lot of grief back in the 90s for talking about how albums had become too long. And a lot of the grief he took was, listen, you're charging us $15 now for this stuff. You better fill it up. But Don's point, and I think we understand it better now, is more is not necessarily better. So I would rather have had that 32-minute Van Halen album and then give me another, I'm not good at math, so 38 minutes or whatever. It would be, give me live cuts, give me alternate versions. Don't try to make me a longer album. Just give me some more crap, but good crap to enjoy once I finished and, listening to the album. That, I think, would have been a smarter way to go. I have a lot of them in the book. In that scenario, you still have those great Pearl Jam and Nirvana and Soundgarden and, Smashing Pumpkins, Siamese Dream, and then Melancholy and the Infinite Sadness, which was a 4-disc set on CD, the equivalent of a 4-disc set. The Oasis albums, there were a lot of bands that did have 70 odd minutes of good music to put on a CD, but not every band.
Yeah. For every band that did that had I got Siamese Dream. That was a great album, but right. You got 10 bands that just put a shit ton of filler in there.
And I would agree with that. Yeah. No,
but I like your idea as far as if you had half an album of good stuff for a 70-minute album, then throw in some bonus tracks or some demos or,
Yeah.
alternate versions or something like that. That would
Yes.
I'd been okay with that.
Give us dessert. You gave us the main course. Now give us dessert and maybe a little after dinner drink with it.
There you
Well,
go.
see, now they figured that out, and that's why we have the
That's why
remaster series and
that's
the
why you're
You get
getting
box
all the
that.
sets.
remasters and all the box set. Well, they were doing the box sets.
Yeah.
Those of course came out in the
Yeah.
80s, but it's a big greedy industry, and they were trying to get the biggest buck for the bang that they could, and but that did, to your point, that drove a lot of people to look for, let's politely call it, alternative ways of consuming their music.
Well, and
Exactly.
the music changed as well. I mean, when being a child of the 80s, a teenager of the 80s and into hair metal and all that stuff when and we Dennis alluded to it when Nirvana and all that stuff came in, I just checked out completely. I never got into it. So I mean, I didn't lose anything because I think some of the stuff that I was listening to at the time, I mean, listening to some of some of their favorite stuff came out. A big Bryan Adams fan, and Waking Up the Neighbors to me
Yeah.
is one of his best records. Um, you know,
Yeah.
every track, and he's a guy that I don't know how many things he's written for other people that he could
Right.
just go do his own. I mean, to your point, do an album and then put the cover. Oh, by the way, the rest of the next five songs you're going to hear are songs I've written for other people. I
Right.
mean, that would have been cool as hell. Now
Yeah,
but to the discussion we're having now, that's happening. So he wrote a couple of songs for Kiss, and now he's released those songs, and you can buy them. And I have
yeah, and the stuff he
I've
did
paid a
for
lot of money for a 45, and don't ask me how much.
I always find
My
this.
wife can hear me in the other room.
Okay, we'll we'll keep it down. Mine's upstairs, but she's a music fan and wrote for the books, so I get away with sneaking stuff into the house. I always find this checking out argument, discussion to be interesting, and everybody's taste is everybody tastes, and I understand and I respect that, with the caveat that I'm right about everything. But when people do say that about the 90s, and the discussion I have a lot because we're gentlemen of a certain age, we I would hand you like Pearl Jam's 10 and
Yeah.
say, I'll put this up against Black Sabbath Paranoid, and I'll put this up against Van Halen 1, and there are Alice in Chains albums, and I think it became a perceptual stylistic thing.
I think for me,
Yeah,
it was I was okay with the hits, but when I listened to the record, I just could not get through I couldn't get through a record. I just couldn't, I didn't have that same, I don't know, attachment to the music. It was just brooding, and I just couldn't. That for
yeah,
me was it. But yeah, I mean, Stone Temple Pilots. That's
yeah.
a good example, right? And Alan and I went to see Stone Temple Pilots back this summer, which I didn't get to see them originally,
Okay,
but yeah, did I know the songs they played? Yeah, because they played all of Purple and
right.
a couple of
Right.
other
Well, they
songs.
were.
And I knew some of them, but yeah,
Yeah. Well, Stone Temple Pilots was basically a hair metal band in flannel,
Right.
when
yeah,
they came out,
yeah,
and a lot of it was sonic too. I mean, they if you put like a Rat or a Dokken record up against even Nevermind or In Utero, they sound very, the 90s, these 90s albums we're talking about were so much more lo-fi, and they
Yeah.
were they were darker and kind of thicker, whereas you had, any of the Van Halen albums, or like I say, Rad or Dokken or Motley Crue, and these were bright, these were punchy, these were,
Right.
in your face, and loaded with hooks.
yeah.
Whereas, Kurt Cobain, as brilliant as he was, could bury a hook like nobody's business.
Right.
Yeah, the
And
records weren't fun to listen to.
no, it wasn't fun. It was
It
art,
wasn't
but it
fun.
wasn't as much fun.
And
Right. Yeah.
Gary, and to that point too, I think too, if you think about the timeline, uh, in the '80s, I was in bands and was dating and all that stuff. I got married in 1989, and then my son was born in '94. It, I'm watching, the what's the train? What's damn it,
Train
what's
spotting. Oh,
No, no.
Thomas
I like
Thomas
I
Thomas the
lo-
Tank Engine.
I do like train spotting those. Sorry, but anyway, no, Thomas the Train and stuff like that. Once you get into that and Barney and all that crap, you know, the that music just doesn't kind of fit that kind of deal. You don't need to be playing that around the kid. You know what I'm saying? They
Right.
could just,
Well,
and I think that was maybe what turned me off on that.
you weren't gonna play Too Fast for Love around your kid though either.
No, no,
Well,
no.
absolutely.
But I did, but no, I think it just, I think I was in a different mindset too. And when the '90s hit and the grunge had just kind of, like I said, that dark kind of, I mean, Black Sabbath was dark, don't get me
Yeah.
wrong, but it
It
was
was a
just kind of
different
this,
dark.
it was a depressing dark. And I'm
Yeah.
like, dude, I'm not depressed. I just got married.
Yeah.
We're working now. I just bought a new house, or a house, but just I was in a kind of a happy mood, and it just, that music just didn't fit my thing. Now I go back now, and like I said, I went and seen Smashing Pumpkins here a while back, and just loved them. They were really good. Um, I did get to see Stone Temple Pilots with what's been doing before he passed away. I can't.
Scott Whelan.
It's Scott Whelan,
Yeah.
Yeah.
and I caught him on a good night, and it
Yeah.
was really, really good. You caught him on a bad night, it wasn't good.
No.
But so yeah, and my wife was more open to that. She liked a lot of those bands. I've never been a Pearl Jam fan. I don't know why, but Soundgarden, there are some things that I like. So there were some of that stuff, but I was just like looking through your book. I had forgot a lot of the other stuff that had came out in the '90s, and I was like going, okay, maybe I didn't hate the '90s that bad, because yeah, I did like that, and yeah, I did like that. It just wasn't something that I listened to on a regular basis.
Well, that's partly too why you had a
Right.
punk resurgence come
True.
about in the middle of the decade. Was that really was an offshoot, but also a response to grunge. Now, Green Day and Offspring, those songs were as
Right.
angsty as anything else, but they were a lot more fun to listen to and a lot more energy
Right.
to them.
Because Weezer came out. When did Weezer come out?
Yeah,
came out.
Weezer was
Yeah, it was-
late
yeah.
middle of the decade.
So
Yeah, that
Weezer's
was
one that I did catch on to. Weezer hit my fancy. Well, of course, that first video with the Happy Days,
yeah.
everything, and that was kind of like, okay, and I kind of like this music, and I did buy that album actually, but so I wasn't totally tuned out in the '90s, but
Gary,
not as
what are
much
your
as-
thoughts? I'm curious about what your thoughts are about country, because that's what happened to me. I just pretty much abandoned, except for the rock bands that were my favorite rock bands that were still hanging around, but the rest of it I just kind of abandoned. And weird, I was talking about it with my wife at dinner tonight. We were talking about this the age and doing this in the '90s or whatever, and thinking about, I did have to go see. I said country, but and we'll get there in a second. But I did have to go see NSYNC because my youngest got grounded, who was supposed to have the tickets to go.
Oh, no.
So
you took one
I
for the
got
team.
punished. So, but it's kind of funny because I kind of like the music. It was different, and I know it seems weird, and people can give me shit about it. I'm sure, but so the boy band thing was just a different phase that came through at that time. So there was, and then there were, then there were the girls that hopped on, the Spice Girls, and all that kind of stuff. It was just pop had changed a little bit, and as well, and it wasn't because I really, it just there was a lot of different mixes, and I don't know if it's still that way. I mean.
Oh, yeah.
I don't listen to enough music right now that's by the new bands I listen to music to are stuff that I get for the podcast typically in other places. I'm not like just randomly picking up a record or, something like that. But if somebody turns me on to something, but like pop radio, I don't listen to it all. I haven't turned on a pop radio station. I don't even know if one exists, to be perfectly honest. But I have found that, it just interesting. It's a lot more. It feels very disposable now, unlike what it used to.
And what's interesting is, okay, back to being the get off my lawn people. It does feel more disposable now because there's so much of it, and the churn is so much quicker. You go back to the '90s or the '80s or the '70s or the '60s. and there was a longer shelf life for a song, for an artist, for an album. They churned longer and were around longer, and we were, look at Thriller.
Yeah.
That was the Taylor Swift of the, or Taylor Swift is the
Right.
Thriller
Michael
of
Jackson,
Thriller.
yeah.
But and whereas now it seems like, the Sabrina Carpenter and the Olivia Rodrigo and the Chappell Roan and the who's ever going to be right after them, it's boom, boom, boom in rapid succession. Shabuzi, who's kind of a country rapper,
Yeah.
followed
Yeah.
up Little Nas X. He's had a song sitting on #1 on the Billboard 100 now for 13 weeks,
Yeah.
which seems insane
Yeah.
because that 2 weeks doesn't happen that much anymore. So there are still some of those outliers, but there's so much music now and so many places to hear it and so many delivery systems that for something to actually plan and stick like a Taylor Swift has is very rare. And I think that's why you see so much of the mania and excitement around her is is she's sticking. She's had at this point, it's what, a 15-year career,
Mm.
and a career that's had a steady ascent rather than the Olivia Rodrigo, Sabrina Carpenter come right out of the box, shoot straight up, and we'll like their song for a minute, and then we like the next song for the
Yeah.
minute, and maybe their next song will come back. It's a very different world. That's one of the things I do miss about an album. Albums being the main currency was that then you had a story being told. U2 puts Achtung Baby out, and it's one song after the other, and we have a little journey with these albums.
Well, and you have
And
some anticipation too, right? So, records come out on Tuesday or records come out on Friday. They don't come out on Monday. What are you doing
right,
releasing a single on Monday?
right,
That was
Right.
like, because I remember I worked in a record store in the late 80s, and that was what we built on. We got Billboard magazine delivered to the store. We all read Billboard magazine, it was coming out in the next couple of weeks, so we could start selling it, or we could start talking to customers about it. Like, hey, you just want to let you know that Motley Crue's got this record coming out. It's going to be out in 2 weeks. We'll have it in the store on two. That kind of stuff. And now it's like, oh, the single dropped today, and there's going to be a different single drop on Thursday, and
Yeah.
the whole. I
It's
don't know
all
if-
digital. You get
Yeah,
it
the
off
experience.
the
Yeah,
net or
it's
whatever.
it's
You
it's
don't.
yeah, as we talked about, but that I think one of the things that we miss is you don't have that anticipation for the package. You don't have
Sure.
that anticipation for the experience that you're going to have. It's just gone, and
And
it's digital, and it's just I don't know. It's just weird.
you
I
don't
don't.
have a you don't
Yeah,
have
get
a
off my lawn.
you don't have but you don't have a tactile relationship with the
Correct. Yeah.
music anymore, whether it was a CD,
Yeah.
a vinyl or a cassette or an 8 track.
Oh
You
yeah,
had
for sure.
you were holding it in your hand. You
Right.
had to go get it. And there's a whole different investments in that, and a whole different emotional attachment than there is in queuing up Spotify and adding things to your playlist or even just listening randomly.
Do I love the convenience of this? Absolutely.
Right.
I have thousands of songs on this bad boy.
Okay.
You
I
know,
thought well, Rod and I sit in our apartment, like I said, in 1980, 87, and we were sitting there, of course, playing CDs at the time because that's where what everybody had. And we just made a comment one night, after having a few adult beverages and everything, sitting there going, you know what, it would be so cool to be able to just at any point pick up any song you want and play it without having, and then, you think that's a crazy, fantastic idea. Guess what?
Yep. Yeah.
It's called, it's
Yeah.
called
You carry
whatever
a
service you're using.
exact.
Spotify guy, but anyway.
Yeah. So that's
Alan, was you wanting to say something real quick?
I'm
But you
just
were-
gonna getting back to the book.
Go
You
for it.
said that you had a list of like 2,300 albums,
that's
and you had to pare it down to 501. Tell us what the process was like getting the 2,300 and how you got it down to 501.
we sent out notes to all the artists soliciting bribes, and we got nothing back.
It was
It
a profit
was,
deal.
yeah.
Well, since you
The
did it now, you got royalties from it.
ex
So you got 1 penny from each
exactly.
artist. That was
Yeah. But what we did was, so there, as you see in the book, there are about 3 dozen contributors who were part of the book and wrote entries. And it was discussions with them. The discussions is a polite euphemism for what some of them were. In fact, there were 5 of us in the book who are regular working music journalists here in Detroit. And during the month or so we were coming up with the final list, we were often at shows together reviewing them. And we would, before or in between acts, we'd be talking about the book and getting so worked up that people around us would call security, thinking we were gonna start swinging at each other. Um, it was a lot of discussion, a lot of back and forth, emails, Zoom discussions, things like that. And, some were easy consensus choices. And others, in the end of the day, it was down to me to sit down and decide, okay, this is in, this is out. And, believe me, I lost some albums that I love dearly are not in the book, but I'll still die on the hill that is these 501 as the best representation of the decade. But yeah, it was a hard process, but a fun one too. I mean, there's when you have a bunch of people who are music geeks, they like nothing better than arguing about music.
Exactly.
So for us to, for me to try to be explaining why Savage Garden does not belong in the book, and to my surprise, be outnumbered by not only the people sitting next to me at the concert, but by the people sitting around us who were listening in. That's fun. That's what you, as a music fan, that's what you love to do.
So from the time that you conceived this, how long did it take for you to get to do that process? How long did it take?
So it was about a month of discussion, and all of that, and getting it down to the 501. The total book production, I think, on my end, delivering a manuscript was about 6 months,
Okay.
maybe 7 months, and shorter on the 80s book because once we had the methodology dialed in on the 90s, the 80s book moved a little bit smoother.
When does the 80s book come out?
That's in May.
In May. Okay.
Ooh, I want that one too.
And that was, well, what's interesting as you go back through the decades. So what I said, what we're talking about, winnowing down the list. In the 90s, artists had started taking 2, 3, sometimes more years between albums. You get into the 80s and the 70s.
Every 15 minutes.
You had significant artists releasing significant albums every freaking year, and sometimes 2 a year.
Well, and just this when we're just talking about that, I used to go to the store. We had a 3D, which was Danner's Discount Department Store, and we had a TGMY, and I would go in there. And as a kid in the 70s, you got a Kiss album every 6 months.
Seemed like it, yeah.
And it was great. I was like, hey, new album. And then, of course, they released the solo albums, and I got 4. I'm like going,
right.
Well, shit, as a kid, I can't spend $5. I don't have $5 an album.
It was great till you got to Unmasked.
Yeah. Dynasty kind of hit me hard too, but anyway.
Well, Dynasty was a pivot point. I mean, I think it brought a lot more people into their
my
orbit.
best friend bailed at that point. He was like,
okay,
I'm done. But anyway,
fair enough.
But I go back, and I actually like Unmasked a lot. So anyway.
Ouch. Sorry.
Well, the nail in the coffin.
They do have medication for that.
But don't say elder, because Bill will have
the nail in the coffin.
Seizure.
The nail in the coffin.
People have tried to explain to me why that was an underrated album.
I like the elder. Sorry.
Oh my God, they have medication for that too.
They're actually doing that. There actually is a group of people, a group of artists that are doing that whole record.
I just saw that
at an event to raise money for cancer in
I want to go
Florida here in December.
About that. Well, they got to have somebody to attend.
Yeah, good luck with that.
I like all those guys. Oh, it'll be a great show.
Hour and a half, never gonna happen.
Come on, Bill, I'll take you.
No, not if you
Sorry,
paid
Garrett.
for it.
That's okay.
Get
We
back
just
to the
gotta
book.
we have to poke each other every now and
No, that's what you should, especially with Kiss. Kiss gives you so much ammunition
then.
to do that with.
So Gary, during the 90s, were you like, and like us, you didn't, sounds like you didn't check out. You really liked the
No, I
90s stuff.
couldn't. I was a daily newspaper music journalist.
Right.
I was covering this stuff as it came out.
You could have been one of
So
them ugly journalists that said, you know what, I hate all this crap,
could have been,
you
but
know,
then what did I get into it for?
that's true.
I didn't get into this to not like stuff.
True.
You want to
True.
find things you like and pass it along to other people.
Right.
So yeah, the fun of going through really all these books, because I'm still working, is, to remember. And some of the entries I use, the ones I wrote in the book, I use some of my interview material that I
Cool.
had from like Santana
Gotcha.
and Metallica
Right.
and Meatloaf and a few of the others that are in there. So it was, the books are kind of a blast from the past for me.
Right.
And remembering, chasing these people down and being at Woodstock '94 when the mud
Oh
was
wow.
being thrown at Green Day
Yeah.
Right.
and then seeing that first Oasis concert at a 500 seat hall and things like
Right.
that.
No, like I said, it's for me, and that's what's good about your book is the fact of it's just not grunge. It is everything 90s, everything that came out. And there was some good music that came out in the 90s.
Oh, there was
I
a
just
lot.
kind of, in my brain, I just think of rock. I'm like, oh, the grunge, the 90s are, but there was some really good stuff that came out at that point,
Well, Bill
different
mentioned,
genres.
yeah, Bill mentioned country earlier in this. This
Yeah,
is where country became rock. This
Yep.
in the '90s,
exactly.
for a lot of reasons. First of all, you had the disenfranchised rock fans, of which we would count you guys among them, and we're looking for that kind of spirited, guitar-driven music, and that's what country became. And it became that because you had the famed class of '89, which was Garth Brooks and Clint Black and Alan Jackson and Travis Tritt. And these guys were raised on rock and roll as much as they were raised on country. So they were more than a little bit rock and roll. They were
Right.
they were using those influences in their music and making a
Yeah.
music that sounded more like rock and roll to certain ears than Nirvana and Pearl Jam did.
Right.
So that's part of the reason country took off. And you can say the same thing about Winona Judd and you know Garth's wife, Trisha Yearwood.
Trisha Wood,
And
yeah.
yeah, and you had this new generation of country artists who a significant part of their makeup was rock and roll music, and they sounded like it. And so a '70s or an '80s rock fan who couldn't get into even hair metal, suddenly they were getting their fix from country music.
It's funny you mentioned Garth Brooks because Garth Brooks talks about one of his biggest influences is Kiss.
Yeah,
That was his, being a country person, that was his
yeah,
hit who he emulated and what he wanted his shows to be like and
yeah,
that kind of stuff. So to your point, I mean, I think it's a very valid point.
yeah,
I
yeah.
haven't tied those together like that before,
No,
but yeah, that's pretty cool.
in his early shows, even in
Oh,
his later
absolutely.
shows, I heard
Oh
him
yeah.
play Kiss songs and play
Yep.
Bob Seger songs and other things, that he was just happy to do and happy to show his audience that this is where he comes from.
Yeah.
So that was one of the huge explosions. And then you had rap obviously had started to make its ascent in the '80s,
Yeah.
but then in the '90s you had West Coast rap and you had the East Coast rap that responded to the West Coast rap, and then they all learned to live nicely together. You had the white rappers who had started to come out during the late '80s. You had European rap. Then we had techno, electronic dance music. You had a real surge there. And of course, you had things like jazz and gospel. And this is before we even get to plain old R&B.
Right.
And
Yeah.
and even there, you had the permutations of New
Oh,
Jack Swing and things like that. So
Boys to Men.
because
Yeah.
music was selling the 80, the 70, the 60s was where the album, developed. The 70s was where the adult world realized the power of pop music. The 80s was where it became big business, and the '90s was just where everything went. Yeah, everything goes, and there are so many people listening to music of any kind, and there's this huge audience that just wants music. And that was really the ascent of the business up until we got to to file sharing and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And even now, people probably listen to music or hear music as much, if not more, than they ever did in the course of their day-to-day lives. But are they really listening like we did to any of the albums we've just mentioned? Not really.
No,
Yeah.
because when we listen to an album, we would get it. We would open it up.
Yep.
We would read the back. We do all that stuff. Then we were, open it up. We read the liner notes. We would know all the lyrics. We knew every person and every, that was in the band. And now kids even like, what's your favorite band? Oh, blah, 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 blah. Well, who's in the band? Well, I don't know.
Yeah.
They just don't know. And we knew, the roadie, the guy, the engineer, we knew all those names because we spent our time instead of listening, and not like you said, not listening to one song and then switching to another band. We would sit down, we would put it on the front and we would listen to it the whole way through. I might skip a side, if I don't like the second side, but we would at least listen to a side.
Yeah.
Which they don't do now. You just sit there and you listen to a playlist. And you listen to either your playlist or you listen to somebody else's made up playlist. So
yeah. Or the thing I do just for work is I will go onto a random playlist and just tell Spotify to, play me stuff.
I'd like that too,
and
actually.
That's, and then, you're skipping over a lot of stuff after you get past the first couple verses maybe, but it's still, it's educational for me. For what I do, it's what I need to do.
Right. It's
so what are your
Go ahead.
Yeah, so what are your thoughts then about, do you listen to music today, like new stuff that's coming?
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts about new artists today? Do you have any, is there anybody that you've like, yeah, I like their catalog, or that is just different or whatever?
Yeah, there's bands like the Skids who are out there now. I should really prepare when I'm going to be talking. They're the Hives, who aren't brand new, but I still listen. They're recent, and of the last 20 years, and I listen to them quite a bit. I find myself gravitating more to what we call Americana, which is that's a term we found in the 90s. Okay, it's not really country rock, or that never felt like the right. So what is this? It's Americana, and I do find a lot of acts, in that particular subgenre who I listen to, and because they sound like Roadhouse rock and roll bands. Mike Campbell from Tom Petty's band has been around a long time, but his band, the Dirty Knobs, is great. And really good. So I never have trouble finding things to like, whether it's albums or songs. They're out there. You just have to go find them.
Mm-hmm. That's something we said on this podcast a lot. It's not like it used to be, popular radio doesn't play what we really want to hear. They play what they want you to hear. So for us, we and this podcast has been great, like Bill said, because we have found a lot of people that we really, really enjoy now because of this podcast that we would have never found.
Yeah.
And it's sad. There's a lot of great bands out there now making great music. They just don't have a platform to get it out there.
Well, one of the things we don't have anymore is that monolithic outlet. And this is going on. This is about all arts, not just music. But we don't have the big monolithic outlet anymore that's helping to steer tastes. Right. We don't have the local FM album rock station. It's not as prominent as it used to be to help steer your taste. And, they did that. That industry did that to itself, by formatting, by consolidating
Clear Channel and all those
again,
people.
Again, a whole other book's worth of discussion on that. But, they largely did it to themselves, because when we all were growing up listening to radio, the disc jockey had some license about what he or she could play. and would be really felt it was part of their mission to turn people on to something new and
Right.
something different. And you can't have that anymore. You get that on certain channels on satellite radio. You can still get that, but it takes effort.
Yeah, it's you can find great new music out there and new people, but like you said, it's you got to really look for it.
Yeah.
It just doesn't land in your lap anymore.
And, for adults, people of a certain age, if you will, parents, working people, you don't have the time that you used to have, that we did in the 70s and 80s to chase the stuff.
And you
You
know
know,
what? On another note, I don't think young people have the mentality to physically do that because they get sidetracked.
where they hear
They don't
where
they don't,
where young people hear most of their new music is in video games.
That's
That's the
true. That's
single
true.
that's the single biggest,
Wow.
driver, especially on the rock side, especially on the heavy rock side.
Right.
But no, the music has to be part of something else that they're
Hmm.
doing rather than being the music for music's
Because
sake.
they're not listening to radio. They're not listening to
No,
radio at
no, no,
all.
no, no, no. No, they're
Not at
listening.
all.
They're either playing games or they're listening to a
Never.
streaming service,
Wow.
or they're going to a movie and hearing something in a movie.
Well, let me steer you
Interesting.
So,
back to the book one more
sure,
time.
anytime.
But besides trying to narrow it down from 2,300 to 501, did you have any other difficulties putting this book together?
No. Um, as you can tell, I've been doing this for a little while, and the people I chose to be and invited to be contributors are friends and colleagues who I'm happy to report are still friends and colleagues after they saw how I edited their contributions. But they were all people I trusted as writers, as critics and as professionals. So I wasn't doing a lot of I wasn't doing a lot of squirrel herding here. I was some are always, of course, better than others or more conscientious than others, but there weren't any that I was either chasing down to 0 hour or having to take their entries away because they didn't have them in yet. So that was, that was a plum. I'm very pleased to be able to say that. But that's what I wanted. I mean, one of the best parts about doing this was to be having these dialogues and to be working with friends and colleagues. And in the case that I would say about more than half of them are from here in Detroit, so people I would see on a regular basis and hang out with. My entire golf group contributed to the book, and other people we socialized with. So, and it was funny getting their entries. Was like, oh yeah, we just had that conversation, or we've had that conversation before, and that's really what I wanted it to be. I wanted it to be music, people who really dig music telling you about why they dig this album they're writing about. And I think they all pretty much nailed it.
Well, tell our listeners where they can find this book.
You can find this book anywhere books are sold, and I do always put in a plug for your local independent bookseller, please. You can also get it out of the trunk of my car if you see me tooling around. Happy to provide you with it. Quarto, QUARTO.com can help guide you to getting the book. And it's out there. I mean, I get the occasional friend who will look at me of like, well, man, this is like a real book. And well, what did you think? What did you think I was doing?
Oh,
This isn't a hobby, dude.
sometimes people say the dumbest things with the best intention.
With the best
Yeah.
intentions.
Bill,
Yeah.
your microphone is muted.
Yeah,
Speaking
Bill.
speaking of people of a
Yeah.
certain age,
we have to all remind ourselves of that every once in a while.
yeah, look at that. Okay, Marcel. Actually, I think his
No,
mic really is unplugged.
his Mike, your mic's not
Either
working.
unplugged or now he's plugged. Now he's
He's
muted.
got a new one.
He has broken his microphone.
See, this
It's
is
a
what
brand new
happens.
mic.
This is
too.
what happens when you're an old guy and you try to embrace new technology. See, I'm
Here.
still hardwired to my your
So anybody
earbuds.
watching
Yep.
on YouTube, hey Bill, use your hand signals. Can you know?
There we go.
Can you?
I didn't hear that.
Well,
He turned it up.
He turned it up.
Gary, we appreciate having you on the show.
Oh, guys,
Hang tight
Actually,
while I take us
Bill,
out
you
of
want me to
here.
ask real
Sure.
quick? Here.
Well, no, he wants to ask that question after we get
Okay.
off.
Okay, we got it. Okay.
All right.
All right,
People
but listen,
visit Ages.
I really appreciate you having me.
Oh, anytime, man. When
This
you-
has
Gary, it's
been
been
this has
fun.
been delightful.
Yeah,
Been
when
fun.
you get the 80s book, we'll have you back on.
I'll
Oh, yeah,
do that.
Anyway, visit agesofrock.com. Check out latest step. Or Bill's got me all discombobulated. Oh, now you can hear him now.
This is if you're listening,
agesofrock.com.
if you're listening to the audio of this only, you need to watch at least the
Oh, of
last
course.
5 minutes of this on YouTube.
Exactly.
agesofrock.com. Past episodes, social media links. Peace out. Thanks for listening to the Ages of Rock podcast. If you haven't done so already, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, like us on Facebook, and most importantly, tell all your friends. Remember, you're never too old to rock. Until the next episode, peace out, folks.